I've been thinking for some time about what Marx meant by the contradictions of capital. The idea is liberally sprinkled throughout his writings, and in many instances he attributes crises to some manifestation of the contradictions of capital, and so this leads me to kind of say, well, what are these contradictions, and how can we actually use an understanding of them to better contemplate not only what's happening to us right now, but what alternatives might be in a contradiction-free sort of world. First I should explain that there are two senses in which the word contradiction gets used in the literature. One is an Aristotelian sense in which something is logically incompatible with something else. So it's a contradiction if I say I am a man and then I say I am not a man. So that's a logical contradiction, and Marx is not talking about that kind of contradiction. What he's really talking about is a dialectical view, which is that there is some tension between two aspects of the same thing. To give you an example, many people, we are told, actually experience very considerable conflict over career ambitions and the wish to have, if you like, a steady, normal and effective family life. This is a condition which is often written about for women, for example, as being a source, a serious contradiction. But it also occurs to men too. Okay, so it's not simply gender special. But in this case, most people live with the contradiction for their whole lives and manage them in some way or other. But then situations arise in which the contradiction becomes unbearable and generates a crisis in individuals' lives. And these crises can be generated by external forces, such as the demand of the job suddenly becomes radically different. People have to migrate, or they have to move, or they have to change their hours or something like that, which makes it very difficult to actually accommodate their family obligations with their career objectives. Or it can come from an epiphany. One day somebody wakes up and says, this is no way to live my life. I think this is absolutely ridiculous that I'm going off to do my job at 7 o'clock in the morning and not coming home till 8 o'clock at night. What kind of life is that? And then they decide, so it becomes a crisis. And the crisis has to get resolved one way or the other. Either people go with the career ambition, or they go with the quality of family life. So Marx's notion of contradiction is that dialectical tension which exists between two aspects of anybody's life. And now, when I started actually checking out how contradictions work in Marx, I kind of started to categorize them in different ways. And I thought there are a number of foundational contradictions, that is, those that are deeply embedded in the nature of what capital is about. And then there are those which are manageable contradictions, which are kind of consequences of the foundational contradictions. And then there are those which I consider to be ultimately fatal to capital. And since everybody wants to know what those are and wants to talk about them, I'll tell you what they are, but I'm not going to talk about them, okay? So what I consider to be the fatal contradictions are, first, the contradiction with nature, if you like, the revenge of nature in relation, so that's one of them. The second is the infinite growth syndrome, which is characteristic of capital and which cannot possibly be accommodated given the nature of the world we live in. And the third is what I call universal alienation, which is a complicated kind of thing, but it really refers to the fact that people's lives are becoming less and less meaningful in any kind of social kind of way. And as a result of that, we're getting a lot of pathologies emerging, a lot of sicknesses emerging, and at the same time a lot of anger being expressed all over the place. So those are the three, but we can talk about those elsewhere. I'm interested in just talking very briefly about a couple of the foundational contradictions, which the foundational ones, as I mentioned, there's a number of them. For instance, the capital-labor relation is a foundational contradiction. The manageable contradictions are simply things like, well, how does a capitalist society manage the distinctions and disparities of wealth and income between the lowest paid and the highest paid? I mean, that's manageable in the sense that capital at various times constructs a society where the gaps between the haves and the have-nots are relatively small, and then other times, as now, they become much greater. But I want to talk about two foundational contradictions because I think they're significant in explaining what happened to us in recent times. The first is simply a contradiction between what I call use value and exchange value in a commodity. That is, let me give you an example. You have a house. Now, the house has a use value. Its use value is that it's a form of shelter. It's a place where people can build a home, build an effective life, do all of those kinds of things. It's often a site of security, of privacy, and all the rest of it. So a house has a use value. It has multiple use values. But we know what those uses are broadly in any kind of society, and so, okay, we can talk about the use value. It also has an exchange value. That is, you have to buy the house or rent the house, and the question is, well, how much exchange value is incorporated in the house, and how does the exchange value affect the capacity to actually realize use values? But then there's a strange thing about exchange values, because exchange values are not simply those which are generated out of how much it costs to produce a house, but how much it costs actually to buy a house. And if you're thinking about a mortgage or something of that kind, then not only are you buying the house, which is a certain thing, but you've also got to pay the interest on the mortgage for the lifetime of the mortgage, and that can be a very substantial amount of money over the lifetime of the mortgage. Now, in this instance, what happens is that the house becomes an exchange value for the person who is residing in it, because it becomes a form of saving. That is, you've bought a house for $300,000, and at this point you have no equity in it, but over time you build equity in it, and at the end of the mortgage you have a house that's worth $300,000, and that's your savings. And when you retire, you can cash that in and live off the $300,000 when you retire. So the house has an exchange value of two sorts. One is how much does it cost to build and all of that kind of thing, and then what's it worth at the end of its economic lifetime. And over the last 100 years, more and more people have actually experienced the house as a form of saving, as an asset in their lives, and building asset values has become important for everybody, including people in that part of the working class that could afford to become homeowners. But then, about 30 years ago, we started to see something else. That is, houses became a form of speculation. That is, that the property market was getting very volatile, and if you bought a house for $300,000 now, then you could sell it maybe in 3 years' time for $350,000 or $400,000. So people started to speculate in housing. So the exchange value of housing became, if you like, a hot item in which people started to invest in housing, not for its use value purposes, but for its exchange value purposes. So I might buy a house with no real intention of building an effective life there or doing something in the community there. I would buy it so that I could actually then sell it 3 years down the line and make a lot of money out of it. So we start to find this behavior going on in the housing market, and so what we see is a distinction between use value and exchange value, with exchange value starting to accelerate. So what happened, as we all know, is that speculation in the housing market became rife, and at a certain point the property bubble exploded. And as a result of that, the exchange value suddenly crashed, and suddenly a lot of people living in their houses found they couldn't afford them anymore, because the housing prices had come down, and they held a very high mortgage and got underwater, as we call it, with the mortgage. As a result of this, there's many homeowners got foreclosed upon, and about 4 million people lost their homes. That is, about 4 million people lost their use value because of this exchange value stuff. At the same time, the housing property bubble made it very hard for people to get access to housing, without going deeply into debt. So you can see how the exchange value was actually destroying the capacity for people to actually acquire the use value. Now this is a foundational contradiction of any capitalist system, that the use value and exchange value, and the big question arises, are we doing something for use value purposes, or are we doing something for exchange value purposes? And under capitalism, what tends to happen is that the exchange value dynamic drives out the use value concerns. So that in the end, the use value we get out of something is contingent very much upon what's happening on the exchange value side. In other words, exchange value dominates over use value with all sorts of nefarious consequences, so that people can't get the use value they really need. And the same thing happens to, I don't know, college education, it happens to healthcare, happens to everything, okay? That there's a use value and there's an exchange value, and the exchange value stuff actually ends up with people being denied the use value. So that's the use value exchange value contradiction, and it's foundational for how capital's markets work, and it's foundational for any society that is based on commodity exchange. So let me go to a second contradiction, and that's the relationship between social value and the representation of value. By social value, I'm really referring to something that's intangible, what the social valuation of something is, and you really can't measure it in any clear kind of way, but we have values, and under capitalism the value is given by something he says is socially necessary labour time, that is how much labour time is really incorporated into a particular commodity. But as he says, a value is immaterial but objective. Now, if it's immaterial, we have a real problem of how to analyse it and how to understand it. So what happens is that actually value gets a representation. And as we know, all representations are in some senses false. A map of the world is not the same as the world, and so there's a certain falsification that goes on. Now, the classic manner of representation of social value is money. Now, money is tangible in the sense that, you have a dollar bill or you have a coin or something of that kind. And in the world that Marx was working in, money was basically sort of put with gold and silver and things like that. So there's a contradiction, if you like, between the social meaning and the representation, because the representation has certain qualities which are not the same as the social meaning. For example, the representation is tangible. What it represents is not. The tangible thing is measurable, so money acts as a measure of value. It acts as a medium of circulation, so it allows you and I to exchange things. It acts as a store of value, so we can actually accumulate money and become wealthy as a result. And then there are other possibilities, like saying, well, it can also be money of account and credit monies and all the rest of it. So we have a variety of monies around which are representing social value, but they don't represent it perfectly. Furthermore, there's a real problem, a central problem with the money form, and it is that it is a form of social power. But it's a form of social power that is actually appropriable by private persons. So that it's a social thing, but I can accumulate masses of it, and if I become extremely rich, I can start to use that social power, as we see, for instance, in the United States in elections right now, to buy elections, or I can use it to dominate the media, or I can use it to dominate people, so that it becomes a means of domination and all the rest of it, which is not at all what social value should be about. When you think of it, I mean, social value should be a value for the whole of society and equally distributed. But here we have this representation of it, which is not equally distributed and can be appropriated by private persons and can lead to all of these class distinctions and disparities in wealth and power and all the rest of it. So there's a real serious contradiction between the social value which we want to talk about and this form of representation. And as a result of that also, given it's a form of representation, you can get representations of representations. So that rather than working with gold, for example, I can start to work with dollar bills, or I can just work with credit monies of various kinds. And the result is there's always something fictitious about the money form, because particularly when you start to work with dollar bills, suddenly the Federal Reserve can create a lot of new dollar bills. It just creates money out of magic. And then you often ask yourself, what's the relationship between the Federal Reserve suddenly creating trillions of dollars worth of money, and what's the relationship between that and the social value which exists in society? So here's a major source of contradiction. So when you look at those two contradictions between, say, use value and exchange value, and between value and its representation in the money form, and you put them together, you see something very interesting about what happened to us in the most recent crisis. As I've mentioned, use value and exchange value were in conflict in the housing market at the same time as the money form started to assume all kinds of credit instruments and manufacturing of wealth, which got out of whack entirely with social value that was being reproduced. And so when you put those two contradictions together, you have, I think, a very, very compelling case to be made that these two contradictions actually grounded the unfolding of the recent crisis. Now, this then, of course, poses us a problem, those of us who are in the anti-capitalist camp, which is, all right, what do we do about these contradictions? Now, Marx made very clear that an anti-capitalist struggle had to be one which was against exchange value. That is, we would want to eradicate exchange value as dominating use value. Now, it may be impossible, particularly in the transitional time, to abolish exchange value entirely, but what the political project has to be is to make use value dominate rather than exchange value. That is, education, healthcare, housing. We construct a society which is delivering use values to people, not a society which is worrying or excessively about how much money can be made and how much exchange value can be made. So that's the first instance. The second instance is, it's pretty clear when I mentioned that actually one of the big conundrums that comes out of the measure of social value and the money form is that the money form allows social value to be appropriated by private persons, that has to be stopped. And the only way you can stop that is to abolish, if you like, the current kinds of monetary forms that exist. And under these circumstances, this means you have to invent an entirely different kind of mechanism for exchange. Now, we will never be able, of course, to do without some mechanism of exchange. I mean, it might be nice that we didn't need it, but I think we always will need some mechanism. But we have to invent a mechanism that does not allow social value to be appropriated by private persons. That is, we need a money form which is against accumulation, and so that there's no possibility of private accumulation of monetary wealth. Because what we saw in the housing crisis was a very simple kind of situation in which people were using housing to accumulate vast fortunes to themselves. And when we look at what the peddlers of all those mortgages were getting and how they became ultra rich, they were using the money form in this what I consider illegitimate way, and peddling the kind of exchange value aspect of the housing, and that is what caused the crash and has led everybody who was dispossessed of their homes to lose their use value, and has inflicted a tremendous destruction on the whole of society. So I think that this way of looking at contradictions is to me a very, I think, inspiring way of starting to think not only about what is going wrong in our contemporary society, but what kind of political project we have to construct an alternative society which is not capitalist, but which actually does give us social value and come up with a better representation of social value at the same time as it concentrates on delivering use values to people. Because in the end, use values are the things we need to live on. We don't live off exchange value. You can't eat money. All you can do is kind of hold it and wield it as a form of social power. So you need the use value. So let's have that as a foundational kind of anti-capitalist political project. One of the other things I've been doing recently is kind of very interesting, is doing this companion to Volume 2 of Capital, and I gave lectures and they're now out on the web. And I think I learned a great deal about how Capital works from very close study of the Volume 2 analysis. And one of the things that crops up there, which is something which is not generally realized, is a distinction between where value is produced, where profit comes from, and where profit is realized. Marx actually builds a circulation process in Volume 2. He kind of says, well, okay, you start with money, you then go into production and you buy means of production, labour power, and then you go into production, you produce a commodity, and then the commodity is taken to market and it's traded for money, and then the money comes back in and we start all over again. So that circulation process can then get expanded. And if you look at that circulation process in which money goes into production and then produces a commodity and then goes back to money again and circulates around in that way, you'll see various agents in this, and you ask about the role of these different agents. For instance, at the beginning of the process, somebody has to assemble the money, and typically in a complicated society, this is the banking industry and the finance and all the rest of it, they assemble the money, which they then lend to the capitalist, who then takes it into production. So there's a distinction between bankers and producers. The producers then produce a commodity, but they don't necessarily sell it themselves, they can sell it on to the merchant capitalist. And the merchant capitalist can then translate it into money. So you have this thing where you have these different agents in the process, and the big question is, what is the cut of each one of these agents? And we have to add in some other agents in this whole thing. For instance, this process does not take place outside of being on the land, and so you have the landlords who are going to extract some rent from this process. We're going to have the state that's going to extract some taxes out of this process. So this process then is sort of going on, if it's going on well, is going on smoothly, but you see in Marx's argument all value is really produced at the point of production, but where it is realized, it can be realized by the bankers in terms of the high rate of interest they're charging. It can be realized by the merchants because they're making, if you like, all of the money out of it. It can be realized by the landlords. It can be realized by the state. And in fact, the profit rate of the direct producers can be very small. If you look at the contemporary situation, you look at an organization like Walmart, which is a merchant capitalist organization, it dominates the producers in, say, China. So China is actually producing all of the profit, but actually realizing very little of the profit. The profit is mainly being realized by Walmart, and of course Walmart also passes over some of the profit to the banks, and some of the profit also ends up in the pockets of the landlord. So there is, if you like, a distinction always between where profit is being created and where it is being realized. And I think this is a very important distinction because everybody, when they want to talk about profits, they always go look at what's going on in production, and they don't look at these others because they kind of say, well, they're secondary and unimportant. Well, they may be theoretically secondary, but that doesn't mean that they're not sites where realization is taking place. And as I've said, the actual profit rate in the production sector can be extremely low because all of the profit is being realized by the bankers, the merchants, and the landlords and the state apparatus. Now this even applies to labour, and I think this is also a very, very important thing to look at. Labourers can fight for better wages in production, and at some point or other they can actually manage to achieve it after vast class struggle, unionisation, all that kind of stuff, and so they get a higher wage. But look what happens to that wage. They take it home, and what happens? Well, they have to pay off the landlord, and the landlord jacks up the rent, and so extracts the money back. They then take the money and they take it to the store. They take it to Walmart, and Walmart takes a chunk of the profit, or they give it to the telephone companies. I mean, I must say telephone companies are some of the worst people these days for extracting profit out of people. and so they get it. Or the extra money they earned is taken in taxes, which, you know, in our society increasingly the tax system is regressive. That is, what it does is it takes money from ordinary people and delivers it to the capitalist class. I mean, this is what's been going on in the United States for the last 30 years, and all around the world this has been going on. So in fact, the labourers are no better off than they were before, because they got a higher wage, but then they lost it back to capital, because some of it went to the merchant, some of it went to the banks, and some of it went to the landlord, and some of it went to the state. So I think these secondary forms of exploitation are extremely important. And when you look at how some of those secondary forms of exploitation worked, for example, in the credit markets in the United States, in housing, a vast amount of predatory practice went on, in which people who were managing to get higher wages had it all stolen back from them by the way in which these mortgage companies were offering supposedly good terms on buying houses, and were actually robbing people. So there's a lot of robbery goes on in the system, or what I call accumulation by dispossession goes on in the system, and we have to look very carefully at that rather than simply what's going on in the realm of production. Now, by accumulation by dispossession, I mean gains which have been made by the populace in general, but particularly by working people, that are stolen back. And they can be stolen back a number of ways. For example, I flew down here to Argentina in American Airlines, and actually the stewardess was complaining bitterly that American Airlines has filed for bankruptcy, and as a result of that, American Airlines says it's no longer going to honour its pension agreements, and it's no longer going to honour its healthcare obligations. So suddenly all of the employees of American Airlines find themselves without pensions and without decent healthcare. Well, this is a form of robbery. It was a right that was actually worked for over the years, and people are now having it stolen back. And what American Airlines will do is they will go to a judge and say, we cannot survive as an airline unless we rid ourselves of all of these obligations. And the judge says, yeah, I see that, so that's okay, just rid yourself of those obligations, and then you can go back to making money as an airline without actually, you know, being responsible for pensions or health care. So this is what I mean by accumulation by dispossession. It's a kind of a system of systematic robbery, and of course this, as I mentioned, has gone on heavily in credit markets, and it's gone on in housing markets. And I have to say, again, if I mention the telephone companies, I think they're expert at adding all kinds of... I don't know what your telephone bills look like here in Argentina, but in the United States, there are all kinds of things added on. There's a charge for this, and a charge for that, and a charge for this, and suddenly, just to get a service, you're paying an enormous amount of money. And this, again, is a form of, if you like, what I consider to be accumulation by dispossession, and this is widespread feature in our society. I'm not saying it's displaced entirely the classic kind of form of exploitation of labour in the place of production. I'm not arguing that at all. I'm simply saying, well, you've got to take account of these other forms of exploitation which are going on, both in the living place and also in daily life. They are, I think, just as important as some of the forms of exploitation which are seeing occurring. And I have to say, for many people, particularly if you don't have jobs, it doesn't mean you're no longer being exploited. In fact, this accumulation by dispossession is particularly vicious when it comes down to actually what's happening to people who are unemployed. I mean, they are preyed upon, they're vulnerable, and these vulnerable populations are destroyed even further than right now, and wealth is sucked up and ends up with all this going to the billionaires of Wall Street and the party of Wall Street, and contributing to the vast amount of social inequality which exists in our society. Just to give you a measure of that, by the way, the income tax returns showed that in New York City, in 2008, the top 1% earned on average $3.57 million a year. That was their average earnings of the top 1%. half of the population of New York City is trying to live on less than $30,000 a year. I mean, this is a tremendous disparity of income and wealth in the city. It's now become one of the most unequal cities in the world as a result of this. But that disparity in wealth is largely constructed out of this process of accumulation by dispossession, and that's why I emphasize it so strongly. Like I say, not to displace the classic Marxist view of exploitation in the workplace, but to say that we have to consider this as a parallel form of exploitation and a parallel source of social inequality.